everybody. Welcome back to the Responsible AI Report. I am very excited. We have Renata Dwan joining us today. Renata, thanks so much for joining us on the show.
No, good morning, Patrick, and it's great to be with you.
It's wonderful to have someone with your expertise and just the long list of experiences that you've had working at this intersection of technology, government. You're, of course, a special advisor to the UN Secretary General's envoy on technology. And of course, the advisory body has just released this proposal on global governance of AI. It really has been a big topic of conversation. And I know our listeners are always interested in just how these regulatory bodies are beginning to shape what AI governance means for them and their organizations. So I'm wondering if we could kind of start there a bit. I would love to get your insights on why you believe AI governance at the global level is so critical.
Sure. A small question on a Monday morning to get us going. But no, I think it's a great question because I think we are seeing a global governance regime emerging. We're seeing regional initiatives, we're seeing industry initiatives, we're seeing states initiatives. And I think it's a fair question to say, well, do we need also a global initiative at the UN in the wake or in light of many of these initiatives? And I would say that the answer as to why we need a global governance initiative or approach at the UN is fourfold. I think the first is simply just the nature of artificial intelligence itself. It is a global technology. It's a general purpose technology with global application. We see that it requires and is driven by critical minerals that are found in specific parts of the world. We see that it draws on and is trained by data, huge amounts of data that is global and certainly transborder in nature. And we see then the range of its applications having really no national boundary or even regional boundary. So it's a little bit about the technology itself. The second is that we're seeing the uncertainty and the debate still around what does artificial intelligence mean, and particularly to artificial intelligence and where it's going. Significant debate within the academic community, within the industry, amongst sort of pessimists, optimists. Are we facing existential crisis of humanity, or are we facing something to get ultimately ever more bored on our social media platforms by? Is it benign? Is it malign? Those sorts of questions we're having, for me, are actually part of an urgency to begin a debate around how do we understand that? And that must be a dialogue. So that how can we address risks, in particular risks that go beyond any border or any issue? The third reason I would say is the question of asymmetry. We see a huge amount of asymmetry around the development of AI. Who has it? Who has knowledge about it, who has expertise in its development. We see that centered around certain big tech companies. We see that centered around certain countries. We see the figures around America and China's data centers, capacity research projects is certainly very high and well above any other states. So there's a question of what are the implications of that power asymmetry for stability in a geopolitically turbulent time and for a sort of equity as we think about going forward. And finally, I would just say from an efficiency market perspective, if global AI is going to have the reach and capacity that it can, then we need to think about how it reaches in equitable ways, and how its benefits are distributed equally, or at least more equitably than they are now. So I think there are all the reasons why a global AI governance approach might be necessary. And I would just end by saying, precisely because of the amount of principles emerging. I saw some figure during the UN General Assembly last week that we're now getting at 640 something, 650 sets of principles around the world on AI. Precisely that range of views calls for us a focus on interoperability as well, that can allow those emerging regimes to speak to each other, to be coherent. That's obviously an interest. So I think those are the reasons why we've been having a call for global AI governance, why the Secretary General established a high-level advisory body on AI with 39 people from all around the world, and why they produced a report on global AI governance approaches, recommendations, and submitted that recommendation to the Secretary General and to the member states just on the eve of the UN General Assembly.
Yeah, it certainly isn't a small topic of conversation to tackle, and especially as you were saying, especially for a Monday morning. I had the opportunity to go through the proposal a bit, and what's outlined out there is really inspiring if we're able to make it work. And that leads to my next question for you. In what you're seeing with the UN and just the work that you do in general, do you believe that global AI governance is possible? There's so many different countries with varying opinions on how this technology should be developed and implemented. How can we ensure that compromise regarding AI's development is agreed upon by so many countries?
That is a good question. And it's a question on many, many lips at this moment in time, where we're seeing artificial intelligence and indeed capacity and superiority in emerging technologies being a core component of the power of a state at the moment. And we see that in our turbulent times. You know, I'm minded a little bit to think about Churchill that democracy is a terrible system, but there's none others that are better, to not paraphrase him accurately. I don't see global governance of AI as a desirable so much as a necessity. The question then is, how can we have global AI governance that meets the necessary conditions of supporting some forms of interoperability, some forms of representation, of coordination, of transparency, and while at the same time doesn't try to overreach and reflects the world that we live in, not the world that we want. And I think that's where the report of the high level advisory body on AI came at a good time, because it came at a time when member states were negotiating a global digital compact. That's the first comprehensive framework for digital cooperation that member states have agreed at heads of state level. They agreed that last week at the Summit of the Future. And it takes some elements of and some recommendations of the high level advisory body's report and its recommendations, and it already is seeking to put some of those in motion. So maybe let's walk through what are some of those and how does that make it realistic. The first I would say is there is no discussion and there is no intent, neither from the Secretary General and certainly not from the member states, the 193 member states that agreed this global digital compact, to have a top-down regulatory framework from the UN. Nor is there any sense that there will be a sort of that in agreeing certain approaches at a global level, it doesn't mean that AI governance is going to be driven at the global level. What I think it's trying to do is trying to do three things. The first is maybe just participation and representation. As you will have seen from the high level advisory report, they surveyed all the current initiatives underway at the level of states and industry, regional level, to look at having debates on AI governance, whether it's looking at the Council of Europe, which has agreed a legally binding act, or whether it's declarations by groups like the G7 group and the Hiroshima Principles, or the Bletchley Declaration coming out of the UK. All of those have partial participation. And when the high level advisory body, when we looked at this in more depth, it was clear that 118 countries today out of 193 are not part of any global governance discussions or any governance discussions. And so if you're looking to think about this general purpose technology that will have impact on every single state, having a representation and participation of a bigger number of actors in that is critical. So I think the representation issue is being key. And that led to a discussion of how do we address the representation, but how do we recognize we have these asymmetries of information capacity. Some states have capacity to engage, drive, assess, regulate perhaps AI, others don't. And I think that led to this idea of having a common independent scientific panel to sort of level the playing field of just even what's the information out there. And that's been a decision of the Global Digital Compact to say global AI governance is about getting us all on the same page of even understanding what's happening. And we see in the climate change debate, the International Panel on Climate Change had a similar exercise, but it's not the only panel. We've seen biodiversity panels, we've seen panels on radio emissions, that sense of trying to say, what is a scientific basis, or what is an empirical basis that we can even begin to debate? Now, it may not be a consensual basis. The panel may say there is this debate versus this debate, but at least it puts that out and makes that more accessible to a wider group of actors and states. So that's the first aspect of what I would say the representation. The second is the what one might call the interoperability dimension. If we're going to be seeing at regional, at industry, at state level, a set of initiatives about the governance of AI, how do they even speak to each other? And that speaks to exchange on emerging approaches, best practices, learning, and engagement. You see, for example, the EU with the EU AI Act, it seeks to be, in its own words, a global regulatory power. And it seeks to set standards that will be taken up by others. Well, they won't be taken up by others if there isn't exchange, learning, and dialogue around that. So the panel proposed a global AI dialogue that would take place on a regular basis between states and non-states actors, and really allow for that exchange, that sustained engagement of what's happening, what's emerging, are we on the same page? And in the event of risks or incidents, serious incidents, how are we responding? So it could form a nucleus of even a network to be able to communicate in events and in situations of crisis. And that global dialogue idea was taken up by member states in the Global Digital Compact. So they will go forward with I think, this idea of a global dialogue. And then the third was a strong sense of the lessons from the internet have made us, I think, all the more acutely aware that while markets create huge amounts of opportunities for incentives for innovation and for growth, market failures do mean that there is a role for governance to engage, even if when we look at the 2.6 billion people still not connected to the internet. So we need to address market failures where incentives to invest are not high. And we also need to look at how do we manage potential asymmetries in wealth and capital and income from the use of that. And so I think the internet has given us some important lessons to say, how do we get in ahead of a technology or at an appropriately early enough so it can be steered in the public interest. So AI applications can be steered towards climate, can be steered towards public health goals, can be steered at disinformation management, anticipating and addressing those risks. So it's partly, I think, our lessons from that we have an awareness of the need to navigate that exchange earlier. And then fourth, I would say, how do we think about the distribution of benefits in a little bit of a more equitable way? And that has led to a huge focus amongst the 193 member states that we're discussing this about capacity. Where is AI capacity building going to come from to develop the skills and talent, to access to compute, management of data? And there, I think that has led to ideas of around capacity networks, capacity building initiatives, funding for those efforts, a sense that we don't want to be left still further behind. We don't want the AI debate to make the digital divide a huge chasm or gulf. And I think that's where has been a big, big driver in the incentives for member states to have this discussion around global AI governance. I would just end by saying none of those are pyramidical. None of those are top down. These are really about saying, how do we establish these distributed networks that can facilitate our governance? But they work on perhaps horizontal levels, regulators having discussions, technical institutes having discussions.
Yeah, related to what you just said, under the Global AI Governance Gap section of the report, there was a comment that stated, let me just bring this up real quick. The technology is borderless, and as it spreads, the illusion that any one state or group of states could or should control it will diminish. I think that this builds off of a lot of what you're saying, and I'm wondering if you could elaborate. Do you believe that ultimately what the UN is doing with global AI governance, or proposing rather, is ultimately about equity and trust, and just finding that middle ground among countries to make sure that we do this correctly? And as you were saying before, learning from past other issues that we've explored?
Yeah, I mean, look, it's important to remember the origins of the UN. It not only emerged from World War II, but its first resolution was about nuclear weapons. So it emerged in the wake of the deployment of a technology that was so powerful, its potential to threaten humankind was stark and obvious from the first instance. Now, we don't have that certainty about artificial intelligence. The debate about existential risk is a contested one. The debate about implications for humanity is also vigorous and ongoing. But we do have the potential to see, especially as we go to AGI and where we go through artificial generated intelligence, that we may be looking at unanticipated outcomes, outcomes that we do not yet know. And therefore, an organization that emerged from a cataclysmic global crisis and a cataclysmic war, that an organization that is dedicated fundamentally around the maintenance of an international order and some form of stability for all its failings, it's inevitable that it will seek to say, how do we think about a technology in that respect? So it's an attempt to say, we need to think about a technology that may have such powerful impacts that it can generate profound change in all our societies, but potentially carries such risks that we assess, understand, and navigate that space in a transparent way and in a collective way. I think it also is about equity. We see our world at the moment where inequality is driving both polarizing domestic debates and certainly polarizing international regional debates. AI has the scope to generate a huge amount of increases in productivity and therefore the attendant income and wealth generation. But it also has huge potentials to upend society's jobs, societal trust still further eroded, and the other potential that we may not yet fully understand and are still busy working through. So some form of thinking about equity in an anticipatory way, some form of thinking about societal transformations, but certainly how that means for relations between states and between communities is really critical. On trust, you know, if you think about, again, the origins of the UN, and if you think about some of the work around nuclear weapons, or you think about arms control, it's often trust is not always a prerequisite to get you to come together, to work together on a particular issue. It is the recognition that absent working together, the challenge is insurmountable. So I would use, for an example, climate mitigation and climate change adaptation and navigation. That requires, and both China and the United States have said this at a leadership level on both of their sides, that requires us to work together. It may not necessarily require us to trust. So I don't think trust is the prerequisite to collaboration, but trust can certainly be enhanced through collaboration. And I would add a final note: transparency. I think the idea of coming together in a sustained way to discuss AI developments has a transparency nudging function. It can require states to explain what they are doing. It can require organizations to point to regulatory emerging schemes or regimes that can facilitate some forms of transparency and in turn facilitate confidence and trust.
Renata, you have certainly given us a lot to think about, but I know I've learned a lot from this conversation today. I'm sure our listeners have as well. I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to join us on the Responsible AI Report. And I really appreciate the work that you're doing in the UN and around artificial intelligence. Before we sign off, I'm wondering if you could share with our listeners, where can they find out more information about you and your work? And also, how can they stay up to date on some of the latest developments happening at the UN as it relates to artificial intelligence?
Thanks, Patrick. And the first, I would really encourage all your listeners to have a look at the High Level Advisory Body's report. It's called Governing AI for Humanity. I have a copy here. This is available in all 6 languages of the UN from the UN website. You can go to www.un.org and then search for the Office of the Special Envoy, Secretary General's Envoy on Technology, OSET. And there you'll find you'll find details of who is on the panel, you'll find information and resources, as well as the full report downloadable in PDF. So I'd encourage you to do that. The second thing I'd really encourage you to, or your listeners to look at, is to take a look at the Global Digital Compact that was agreed at the Summit of the Future. That's also on the same website. You can also find that if you type in Summit of the Future, where all the documents are available that were agreed. There you'll see what member states have committed to, and you'll see that they've committed to this setup of this AI panel, scientific panel, to an AI policy dialogue, to explore options for a global fund on AI, and to taking forward work on capacity building. You'll also see the normative basis that they've committed to international law and human rights law as the foundations for AI governance, which is a not insignificant step in these days. And then I would really invite interested observers, interested in listening, to think about endorsing the Global Digital Compact. Now that it's out, it's open for endorsement from networks, civil society networks, technical community, academia, private sector organizations. If you're interested, if your organization is interested, to sign up for the endorsing the vision and principles, or indicating what areas and what action areas that you're interested in and engaging in. It's really an attempt to try to have a holistic approach to digital cooperation, everything from connectivity right up to AI governance. And obviously, therefore, needs a lot of actors to engage if we're going to take it forward. So those are the areas I'd say watch. And then please follow this space. There will be opportunities to comment and engage. And we look forward to the insights of everybody working on responsible AI as we go forward.
Wonderful. Well, I'll make sure to include those various resources in our show description. So, listeners out there, all you have to do is scroll down, click those various links provided. Renata, thank you so much again for taking the time to join us.
No, thank you, Patrick. And I look forward to following your future discussions.